I think what has happened is our culture today has returned to Gnostic thinking on steroids, basically. And what I mean by that is a dualistic belief in human nature.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast, a podcast dedicated to helping you grow in your faith. We're here to coach you up, especially when it comes for thinking for yourself, because how you think is one of the ways you determine what you believe about yourself, and what you believe about yourself is one of the most important things about you. My name is Jesse Mayer. I'll be your host, but we cannot do this without the one, the only, the Salty Pastor himself, Dr. Douglas Peak.
Hey everyone, so good to be with you, and this is a big week for us. A lot of great things happening on the Salty Pastor ecosystem. We're launching a website at the end of the week. We're going to be able to then have search aspects to it, so you can go back and look at various passages that we've exegeted and that we have discussed and dug into. And so if there's a passage of scripture, maybe you have a question about it, you could go back and listen to an episode of The Salty Pastor. We have over 400 episodes now, which is a pretty remarkable feat. And we're just going to keep zooming ahead. So I'm so excited that you are a part of the Salty crew and that you've joined us. And I hope that we can continue to help you grow in your faith, get stronger, more confident, knowing what you believe, why you believe it, where you're going in life, and why it's important.
Absolutely. And we are in our series titled Exposed, the Intimacy Illusion. And it's all about how human desire for intimacy and how the world attempts to manipulate our sexual drives, our desires, and our need to achieve intimacy. However, what they are offering is not working. On Tuesday, we started by showing how our nature is designed for intimacy, but the world only offers illusions of this intimacy, and that's what's kind of causing our downfall in a lot of areas.
Yeah, that it's an illusion of intimacy, which is really interesting because if we're driven for intimacy, we want the real thing. And I think this is kind of the meaning of what Jesus did tell the woman at the well, and that is, whoever drinks of this water will thirst again, but whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst again. And that's really the point here, and that is when you drink from the earthly well of intimacy, it tends to always make you thirsty again. But if you drink from the well that Christ brings, then you end up never thirsting again. It becomes a wellspring inside of you, welling up. That's why I think it's going to be a great study, because into our world today, right now, intimacy and sex have become synonymous. And I think that's why people can live in a world of sexual freedom today, but have no intimacy in their lives. People are more, alone and isolated. And now I understand why people see them as the same thing, because intimacy is that point of complete vulnerability. We talked about in the creation event, how this is a part of our nature to be. And if you're naked with somebody, right, that's kind of a vulnerable situation.
Right.
However, if you mistake sex for intimacy, all kinds of bad things result. So in order to understand the real connection between intimacy and sexuality, you have to go back to why we get the connection between the two wrong. And we get them wrong because we don't understand our true nature. And as we pointed out on the Tuesday podcast, our nature is spiritual, meaning the soul, and it's material, meaning your physical body. And the two are intimately connected. They influence one another. And what's interesting is that some people disconnect them. Gnostics did it in the first century, but even some Christians do that, right? And what happens is when you see the desires of the drives, the experiences of the physical body is completely separate from your soul and spiritual, that ends up creating confusion, right? And you end up saying things that God created and are a part of your image, of his image in you say are evil when they're not. And this is where you get into asceticism and legalism and these types of things. So our whole goal is to try to figure out our true nature so that we don't separate the two, and we understand the interconnectedness of them and staying away from the confusion that ensues when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, obviously is just something that is ravaging us across the world.
We're pretty ravaged.
Yeah, because I mean, honestly, even in the attempt for me to try to help design the graphics and stuff for this series, I had to keep coming back to you and be like, okay, explain to me what you're really talking about with this, right? Like the fact that
that's pretty normal, Jesse. People go,
but like,
what are you talking about?
But trying to define intimacy, what area we're really talking about. Like I kept having to come back to you to try to really understand what it was you were trying to communicate, because it has gotten so interwoven with like, okay, well, intimacy is just sex, right? And like, or this idea of trying to separate things that really shouldn't be separated, but equally pour in, and there's a weaving, like it's all just so interconnected that no wonder we get so confused when people say, well, it's just sex and it doesn't mean anything, and there's no bad thing that'll happen to you for having it, or the opposite, which is never have sex, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad, it's bad. And you're one of the first people I've really heard of like, no, your sexual desires aren't innately bad, but can they be used for bad? Can they be perverted? Yes. But you shouldn't be afraid of them. You need to accept them because they're part of what God has given you. They just need to be expressed and used in the right situations, similar to our anger, similar to a lot of other desires we have and things that we experience. And so just coming from someone as a millennial who grew up in the purity culture movement, there's some tension going on here with this thought process, right? So talk to me a little bit about the practical implications of that separation, that first century Gnosticism of physical and spiritual separation.
Well, I think that in order for us to really understand how sexuality and intimacy are linked together, the soul, right, and the material body, we won't be able to understand the illusion of intimacy that the world offers versus the authentic intimacy that Jesus offers. So basically, bear with me as I go back and try to build the framework for understanding. And that's what I really want to do here, because these are really challenging ideas. But when you get them, two things happen. One is you really understand the biblical definition of human nature, which then turns around and helps you understand your salvation, right? Okay. And what did Jesus really save you from? And the problem is that, on a side note, we're so legalistic. We think that Jesus saved us from making mistakes. And we don't understand the influence and the corruptibility of sin and how it's more like a cancer than simply a mistake, and how it impacts our thinking and everything else. And so Christ came to redeem us completely, not partially, but completely. And so this framework is really important for help understanding. And so I want to hit you with some ideas. Okay, number one, in philosophy, metaphysics is basically the discipline within philosophy that simply asks the question, what is real and how do we know it's real, right? How would you know that? A great movie that was built around this concept was The Matrix, right?
Yes.
With Neo. And that is, how do you know this is really real? And so their answer, of course, well, there is a way to know it's real. And this idea also influenced science. And that is, when we do a study, how in the world, when we do research, how do we know objectively that what we've discovered is true? Right? So we set up all of these processes in the experiment itself to remove the taint of the scientist. And then we send the results off to somebody else, and then they recreate the experiment with the same results. And you start realizing, okay, so this is true, right? Objectively true. And so there is a way to know that something's real. Okay, so that's the first thing you got to understand. And this is where actual spiritual growth, I think, happens in the life of a follower of Christ. And that is, I, as a follower of Christ, should ask myself the simple question every single day: how do I know what is really real? How do I know what's real and not just my subjective and somewhat tainted opinion of what I think is real? This is why Christians can be more tolerant than anybody else, right? This is why Christians can be more open-minded, more accepting than anybody else. On a side note, I'm tired of this notion that secularism and anti-Christianity, or get rid of Christianity, creates a more tolerant society. Well, has it? No. Americans are more divided now than ever before. The more we get rid of Christianity, the more we get rid of faith, the more we get rid of God and all of our institutions, the more divided we become. It's just insane how bad it's gotten today, you know? But back onto my point. And that is, Christians can be these people because they're constantly asking the question, what is real and how do I know what's real? And this is where your actual spiritual growth happens in your life, is you want to grow in a direction that aligns your belief system, your actions, your convictions and values with what you know to be actually real. In other words, everybody wants to change into a better person. Everybody wants to grow stronger. But how do you know you're becoming a better person and not just more cantankerous?
Right.
Who tells you that, right? Well, how do you know what being a better person actually is? Is there such thing as a better person, and how do you get there? Do you see the point?
Yeah.
This is what metaphysics asks, and this is what Christians do every single day, okay? Now, and that is the core spot where sexual issues are so influential on Christians. And the reason why is because our world weaves in illusion around our sexuality that is difficult to separate fact from fiction, truth from falsehood, and reality from illusion. From the beginning of recorded history, there's always been some confusion around the connection between your soul and sexuality. And it's always been used by Satan to trip people up. You know, just read the Old Testament and you see this, right?
Right.
But today, with the advent of things like gender ideology, the LGBTQ plus movement, a lot of these other things, it seems that now there is a greater confusion than ever before about what is sexuality. And my question is, why is that? Well, because in the discussion of intimacy and the desires of our soul for intimacy, we cannot underestimate the impact of the sexual revolution in American society on dividing sex and intimacy. Okay? The physical act of sex from the spiritual. And this is what's so interesting, is that up until this point, most people thought the reason why Christianity was so interested in keeping people sexually pure until they're married was because it cared about kids. Right? It wanted to do what was best for kids. And what was best for kids is that they not be, back then they called it illegitimate, meaning, raised without both parents. And so there were a lot of shotgun weddings back then. Well, the bottom line is that wasn't the main reason why Christianity propagated spoke against sexual immorality, right? Or fornication, which was sexual context before marriage. The reason why wasn't to protect kids, even though that was a symptom of it. The reason why is because it was an expression of our nature and the true nature of intimacy. And so when the sexual revolution came along, it was so deceptive because basically what it did is it wove 3 or 4 different things together. And a lot of people are not aware of that. Number one, it wove together, it's mostly a part of the hippie movement, but it wove together an anti-war sentiment because of the draft. You don't know what the draft is.
Well, I know what it is, but I did not experience it.
Yes, and the oppression that was, and it's good that our country got rid of it, but people were being conscripted and they would go fight in, a foreign war, and nobody understood the connection there. And so you had this anti-war movement on campus. Second, it's an anti-establishment movement. And of course, this is part and parcel with the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory on our university campuses. But third was the advent of the pill. for the first time, there was a broad-based contraceptive that allowed women to not get pregnant if they were sexually active. And so this was immediately, it was like, well, that's why we don't need Christianity anymore. Because Christianity only cares about not having kids out of wedlock. That's all it cares about, which is completely false. It's a misrepresentation. But what happened is this launched the sexual revolution. And most of our inability today, right, to experience true, authentic intimacy in our marriages, with other very important relationships in our lives and our immediate family, is because of the values that were seeded into our culture from the sexual revolution of the 60s. I believe there's a direct correlation, a causal link between what they seeded into our culture and today's young people unable to have long-term, intimate, fulfilling relationships. So what happened is these values that were seeded into our culture in the sexual revolution was this: sex is the goal. And since having a kid is no longer a problem, the more sex you have, the more sexual freedom you have, then the more happy you're going to become, right? Mm-hmm. Obviously, this is not true.
I think what's interesting is that we have to be cognizant of the fact that there are some ideologies that are absolutely affecting the way we think about interacting with other people, right? Like it's become part of this sort of just who we are, right? Of like, yeah, this is just a thing that is now applicable in America. And if you think opposite, or if you choose something different, then you're just being a prude, or you're just choosing something different, right? And I think what you brought up was so important, because the idea of, well, originally it was taught around the idea of protecting the kids, but God had so much more of an upstream idea about it, of like, this is how you actually experience true, authentic intimacy with a person. And I want you to save it for that, because it can create something really beautiful. But when you just degrade it down to there's a physical act that you're performing for, you know, gratification, then it's like
separate from your soul.
Yeah, it separates all this thing, and then it creates all this dissonance within you, and it creates so many other issues, right? So it's like, yes, the downstream effect is, yes, kids are taken better care of, they are modeled better relational things, all of these different things are downstream effects of the fact that God wanted us to have true intimacy, right?
Correct.
And so talk to me a little bit about what the primary influences of the sexual revolution that we really need to be aware of if we're going to be seeking biblical understanding about our nature or our need for intimacy.
Well, I think what has happened is our culture today has returned to Gnostic thinking on steroids, basically. And what I mean by that is a dualistic belief in human nature. And we see the evidence of this everywhere we go. And what I'm trying to do here is, once again, build a framework of understanding, because we can't understand why a parent, right, would tell their 4-year-old that they were born in the wrong body and then push them towards a transition, which is an irrevocable mutilation of their genitals, right? And how do people get to that point? And well, you can't understand that and how to engage and debate and influence that for a better outcome if you don't understand where it originated from, the derivation of it, kind of the upstream where it got off track. And I think it's this dualistic thinking about human nature. So one of the most interesting things to me is how much people in today's world think exactly like the Gnostics did 2,000 years ago. Gnostic thinking 2,000 years ago, you had different forms of it, just like today you have different forms of it. There were Stoics, and Stoics were like, well, we're splitting, my spirit and my flesh are different. It's all about my spirit, so I'm going to kind of control my flesh, right? So I don't think about it. I only think about the spiritual side. And then they were like hedonists, but basically said, well, since your flesh doesn't matter, then do whatever you want, because in the end it doesn't matter. And what I find so fascinating about this as a culture is we've divorced the soul from the material body and reduced sex to a simple appetite or desire. And so today it's what you do sexually with your body has no impact on your soul, and your soul doesn't have any impact on your body. And now we have all these implications of this underlying or upstream idea, this underlying philosophy. For instance, you may have heard of various forms of Christianity. They say, well, it actually doesn't matter how you live or what moral choices you make or even what you do with your own body, as long as you just believe the right types of things. Craig Rochelle wrote a book called Christian Atheist to point this out. It's like, this is dualistic thinking. When you separate your material existence from your spiritual existence, and this, of course, was Gnosticism from the first century. That's exactly what they were doing. The biblical definition of your nature is that you have a soul and you have a body. These affect one another. They have a powerful influence on one another, especially when it comes to your sexuality. So in the dualistic perspective of the world, where your material body has no influence over your spiritual nature, then you have to ask yourself, then why don't we see the outflow of that in any logical sense? Case in point, why do women who have sex with guys too quickly always feel used or objectified, right?
Right.
What I mean, this is a standard thing. Women who have sex with guys too quick.
We see that all the time. Yes.
Yeah. They say, I feel objectified or I feel used. Well, okay. Feeling used, sensing that you're an object is a spiritual perspective. It's not a physical one. So if the two were separated, then why does having sex too quickly or nonchalantly result in a spiritual sense? You see how that can't happen if they are separated. Here's another example. Why is it that people struggling with addiction have to deal with the guilt and shame and failure associated with their addiction in order to break free from it? If an addiction, like to alcohol or to drugs, was simply a material issue, then couldn't you just materially, get over it? Right? But you can't. The 12-step program,
deeper than that, right?
Yeah, the 12-step program has proven to be the most effective addiction recovery process on the planet. And what is the first step of the 12-step program? And that is, I have to make a spiritual admonition. That, right? I need a greater power to help me get over this, which I find fascinating. So even there we see, okay, here's the world's dualistic thinking, and it's not until you bring them back together and get rid of dualistic thinking that you can understand why it works. Another example, research shows that females who have more than 6 or 7 sexual partners only have a 20% chance of bonding to a lifelong partner after that. Okay, well, why is that? Why is a female whose body count goes over 7 have only 1 in 5 chance of actually bonding? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah, it shows there's something deeper, right?
There's something so much deeper going on. Another example, if the physical, now this is controversial, but I want you to really think about what it means. If the physical has no influence over the spiritual doesn't exist, as atheists would say, then why does the sexual molestation of children mess kids up so much for their entire life? Why is sex abuse of minors so inherently evil? Why do people who suffer this need decades of therapy in some cases to be able to deal with it and overcome it? Well, the evidence is plain. You have a soul, you have a material body, and in this life, the two are intimately connected. If you then abuse one of those, what gets wounded in the process? The other one, and vice versa. If you would try to separate them, which is what our society is doing, it is dehumanizing. And what our society is doing through Gnostic thinking or dualistic thinking is creating the potential for more sexual abuse of children and the sexualization of children. Because in the mind of people who have divorced the spiritual from the material, material or the physical, guess what? It's just a physical thing. I'm not really hurting this child at all, right? I'm not hurting this child at all. And yet everybody else on the outside looks at that and goes, that is so evil. And that child grows up and needs a tremendous amount of care, support, and therapy to get over that trauma, something that happened to him as a child. So the notion that you're going to divide the two and say the soul doesn't matter is absolutely absurd when you look at the evidence. All of these examples that I just shared overwhelmingly prove a simple point. Your sexuality is directly linked to your spirituality. That's the point.
Yeah, I think we have to, when you really lay it out, and again, this really comes down to what you are consistently pushing us here on the Salty Pastor to do, is when you really start thinking through it, you're like, well, yeah, of course that makes sense, right? Mm-hmm. Like, as you bring these thoughts forward, if you're not actually thinking past the first or second layer of what the world is telling you, they do seem to be like, oh yeah, the world's right. But then as you really start going down this rabbit hole and you present this evidence, it forces you to at least reconsider, okay, well, maybe not. Yeah. Maybe what they've told me isn't accurate. Maybe what I feel, quote unquote, isn't always accurate, right?
It's an illusion.
It's an illusion. It's almost like we were trying to tie it into that.
Oh, you're so good at what you do,
smart.
Jesse.
So talk to me a little bit as we're wrapping up about why it's so necessary to have this framework in mind before you can really dive in deeper in this series with us, Pastor. What does this framework provide?
Well, I think that most of the sexual issues people are facing today are because they have tried to separate the act of sex from the thirst for intimacy in their soul. What they're trying to do is like a guy who, let's say there's a guy out there who has an issue with pornography, right? And so he spends all of his time telling himself, looking at pornography is a sin and I need to stop sinning. Okay? So what is that? That's all the emphasis is on what? The physical.
Right.
Right? And I think that if he really wants to be free of that, he has to ask himself the simple question is, well, why am I trying to quench the thirst of my soul with that? And that's a whole nother layer of self-evaluation.
Yep.
And once you get to that point, and this is actually something, and I've kind of talked about this before, but when you get into deep therapy sometimes and you realize I'm trying to use something, I'm trying to self-medicate, and I'll have something that triggers me, and then my psychology, I'm not saying about me personally, but what people who've dealt with this deal with is my psychology says, run to this thing and it'll help me feel better.
Right.
And I have to realize what people have to realize to get over that, break that cycle is, okay, what does my soul really need? And because what happens is once you fulfill the thirst of the soul, it becomes a wellspring of life within you. So you're not spending your life doing what? Oh, that's a sin, stay away from it.
Right.
That's a sin, stay away from it. That's a sin, stay away from it. What happens is your soul is filled with the wellspring of life, and you go, my soul is so fulfilled, that's not even a temptation for me anymore. And see, that is what we're trying to get at. And when it comes to your sexuality, is that I want people to understand is that the most fulfilling sexuality that they will ever have is when they ask the most important question of all, and that is, how did God design my soul to be quenched with intimacy?
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, Pastor, so much for this deep dive. I really appreciate the opportunity for us to really get into this. And I know, obviously, some of you out there like to listen to the podcast with your kids. This, as you can tell, is probably not going to be the series to do that on. But I think it's something important to talk about. I think it's something that can get overlooked, or there's thoughts that this is what the church believes about this, or this is what my pastor believes about this, that sometimes we don't realize what you actually see, what the Bible says about it, right? It doesn't ultimately come down to what the church believes or what you believe. It comes down to what does the Bible and what does God say about it. And then you have to make a decision from there, right? And so I appreciate you diving into this. We are so excited. Tomorrow morning, Friday morning, we are launching the Salty Pastor website. Make sure you guys tune in, go check it out. It's going to have some cool features. We're going to be adding additional features the longer it's up, but it's going to be a cool place to start really getting deeper into the Salty Pastor ecosystem. We have some fun ideas of things that we're going to be doing on the website. So it'll be something you're going to want to check out. Give us some feedback. Let us know what you like, what you'd like to see on there, and we'll see what we can do. So thank you guys so much for joining us, and we'll see you on Sunday here at Foothills Christian Church or next week here on the Salty Pastor Podcast.
Please keep thinking for yourself.